One of the most important thinkers in not only continental philosophy, but analytic philosophy too, is Hegel. And Hegel is important in my philosophical journey for really opening up ideas of ontology and opening up questions of identity, which go on to be examined in post-colonial studies and postmodernism, lots of other kind of French theory and psychoanalysis to an extent. But Hegel, for me, has always been a little bit difficult to explain, but I think I'm going to kind of try here to explain what Hegel is on about in terms of ontology, because Hegel opens up the idea of a system that can be completely comprehensive of reality. And I think that can be really useful for talking a lot about topics today, because as terse as Hegel seems and as dense and unnecessary his thought may seem, it's actually very important for spawning, for example, kind of dialectical materialism, which is going to examine history in terms of like class struggle through Marxism. And it's also going to influence the birth of discourse and discourse analysis in like Foucault and Edward Said and other post-colonial thinkers and postmodern thinkers as well, like Baudrillard. And as such, Hegel is really, really important. If we really want to start out by understanding what Hegel is trying to get at first, we have to start with Plato and really lay some groundwork with some of the ideas that undergird Hegel's thinking. And we can put this simply by raising kind of the question of what ontology itself is. Ontology is kind of the philosophy of being, or the study of being. It is generally understood as trying to figure out what things actually are, what the idea of something being even means, or what existence actually means. And that can be confused, for example, talking about what does existence mean, like saying like what's the purpose of life. That's not necessarily what ontology is trying to get at. And if we want to understand this a little bit more, I think it's useful to have an example. So take, for example, a table. The question can be raised, what is a table? And when we do this, we run into a number of things. We can talk about its properties, or we can talk about what it does or what it's used for. And in terms of the table, we can start to understand it by listing certain properties that it has. It's flat, it has 4 legs, it can be used for laying things on or writing on or all sorts of other things. But we start to kind of lay out a picture of exactly what a table is. But the problem is that we can talk about a table in 2 ways, and this is a really important part of just philosophy in general, but especially ontology, is we have universals and we have particulars. Now, particulars are going to talk about a particular thing. They have a particular referent with which they are talking about. So if I say table, and by table I mean a particular, I'm talking about a specific table. I'm talking about one table which has a set definite identity, which the word table represents. And we can see how this is encroaching upon some ideas of linguistics too. And when we talk about a universal, we are talking about tableness, all tables, the whole domain of things that the word table is referent to. So this could be tables that are meant for holding up sculptures, and tables that are meant for writing on, and tables that are meant for working, and tables that are meant for storage, or all these different things. And there runs into a problem between universals and particulars. Let's say we have two different tables. One table has 4 legs and the other has 3. Before, we had sketched out a rough example of what tableness was, namely 4 legs, it's flat, can be used for writing on or holding things on. But immediately we have something that butts up against this definition that makes us call it into question. And it's like, what's the big deal? We just alter our definition and we say, okay, it can have a number of legs and it's still a table. The problem is, if we want to talk about tableness, each time we run into these contradictions, the universal category becomes a little bit wider. And this runs up against an issue when we start to talk about the peripheries of these definitions. For example, if I have a wavy table, like it doesn't have a flat surface, it has a real wavy surface. You might say, okay, yeah, that's a table. It's just like, it's separated from kind of what we might be used to. Both it looks different and it's not clear if we can use it the same way, if we can lay things on it the same way, or if we can write on it unimpeded or something like this. And each time we're doing this, our idea of tableness is getting broader and broader and broader. And the question becomes, is materiality at some point going to fail us in talking about a table? When we talk about a table, we're talking about its material properties that it has. It has certain attributes which make it what it is. And the question can become, can we have any one definition that will take into account all particulars? And this might sound like it's strangely divorced from any practical questions, but for example, if we talk about the definition of a human, this all of a sudden takes on a much more critical question. If we are trying to define what it is to be human, we can say, okay, a human has 2 legs and 2 arms and 10 fingers and toes, and it has eyes that can see, and we can make it more complex and say it has rational decision-making capabilities, has personal agency, maybe say it has rights or something like this, which is kind of starting to get out of our ideas of materiality. But the question is, if we have this definition of human, we will always run into contradictions. For example, we have amputees who don't have all their limbs or all of their appendages, and obviously we're not going to say they are not human. You could, but I think you'd be hard-pressed why exactly to draw the line at any one point. Because the differences from human to human are such that a universal category may seem to have a lot of meaning, but when we actually delve into it, may actually turn out to not be very helpful. For example, if we say that a human is defined by its rational decision-making capabilities, that this is what's setting it apart from other animals, that gives it its unique being, well, what about someone who's in a coma or some kind of vegetative state? Are they no longer human? not usually, especially if we think about today's discourse on, for example, physician-assisted suicide. The question, I mean, do we really ever treat humans like they just stop becoming human if they don't have certain cognitive faculties? What about someone who is born with some kind of genetic abnormality that is severely impairing their mental capabilities in comparison to most other humans? Obviously, they're not human. They're just different, right? And we could take this on and on and on with all sorts of different categories. And for example, in abortion, the question is a fetus a human? And by what right? It doesn't have rational decision-making capabilities. It doesn't really have much personal agency. It doesn't have any memories. It's this whole nebulous case of maybe we want to say that at a certain stage in fetal development, it's going to gain this property of becoming human. But the line we draw anywhere becomes rather arbitrary. For example, in modern discourse, there's the idea that life begins at conception, or life begins at the heartbeat, or at a certain level of brain function. And always the question that should be in the back of our heads is, why draw the line at that point? It seems that we may be able to provide a cogent definition for most humans, but the question can be raised, by what right can we exclude certain peripheries as justifiably not in our domain anymore? And Hegel is coming up against this kind of as a response to Plato, because Plato says, for example, we want to talk about colors, and say we have a white table. And we ask, what is this table? What makes this table what it is? And because we're using the word table, we're using something that is both a universal, it can refer to other tables, but also using a universal to refer to this particular table. And we can start talking about the isness of the table, of this particular table. And we can say it has legs, and it has a flat top, and it can be used for such and such and such. And it seems that we can just ask the question, well, what is a flat top? Or what is a leg of a table? Or what makes something useful to write on, or able to be written on, or not able to be written on? Or what makes something able to hold things on it? Because certainly there are cases where we might say, okay, this might be an inconvenient option, like the wavy table. We might say, okay, you can still lay stuff on it, you just can't write on it, and maybe it still counts. But Plato, for example, might look at this white table and he says, okay, we want to talk about what this color white is. What is it about white that makes it what it is? It's unclear how we can really get behind these categories that seem to have no more bottom. We could say whiteness is a frequency on the electromagnetic spectrum, and it's a visual response encoded in our brain from waves that we see and intercept through our ocular mechanisms and turn into an image. But then we can just ask the question, what is that electromagnetic radiation? And then we could ask the question, what are those particles that are making up that electromagnetic radiation? And eventually we're going to get to some bottom where our faculties are unable to go any lower, or just kind of stuck where we are, and we might be able to go lower, but it's kind of like, are we just limited at that point? And Plato says, okay, what makes something white? Because, and obviously this isn't verbatim Plato or anything, but you've got different shades of white. And Plato's like, okay, maybe there is some absolute whiteness, a form of whiteness, with which, when we refer to anything as white, we are using the universal idea of whiteness, which is a form, to talk about a particular, which is a subset of that whiteness. Now, this might sound like we've solved the case, but Hegel is not so convinced of this because he thinks that this idea of this form, this is Plato's idea of forms, that every quality has some absolute version of it in its own realm of forms. And it's kind of confusing exactly where this realm of forms is or what this realm of forms is. But the idea is that we have some universal which is able to take account of all the particulars with which we refer to in that realm whenever we linguistically use the universal to talk about the particular. And Hegel has a problem with this, which is that it's easy to talk about and say there is a universal, but it's not really grounded in anything. We can say there is some absolute whiteness up there, but Plato says we can never actually access this realm of forms. So if we can't actually access it, how do we know that the terms we are using, namely the word white, how do we know that is in reference to a particular absolute? And how do we know that the particular that we are applying that category to can be linked to that universal? And Hegel says, okay, look, instead of referring to some high in the sky form that is abstract, let's try to ground it in some sort of logic and an ontology that we can grasp. And an important part of the critique of the forms is Hegel thinks that a pure abstract universal on its own is completely empty. It does not say anything at all. For example, this is talked about in an interview with Peter Singer and Brian McGee, where they're talking about Hegel and Marx. And Peter Singer is talking about Hegel's idea of history and how it is a sort of rational progression of dialectical unfoldings. And we're going to talk about this later. I just want to kind of get this out there. And that this is kind of going to come towards some eventual culmination, some sort of finishing point, which Hegel is calling absolute spirit, or the absolute with a capital A. And this kind of has something to play on with what he thinks about God, for example. And Peter Singer says, let's say we have London, and London has all these meandering streets. It's not just a perfect grid layout of square streets, but in fact it's all sorts of highways that meander in and out, and all sorts of twisty roads and triangular properties that make weird triangular spots of land. And he says the idea of rationality is not grounded in some high in the sky absolute universal idea of the rational, but rather the rational is grounded in a material process, in something that we can ontologically take hold of. Because you could say, okay, we want to make London better. We might say there are some problems with certain intersections and certain property rights issues and certain parks that are weird shapes or something like this. Let's just raise the whole thing to the ground, just burn it all and get rid of it all and reconstruct London in a perfect matrix pattern with perfect square plots of land, such that it is perfectly rational. Everyone has got the same amount of land, and there's there's no issues with taking account of all of London anymore. We know we've made it better because we've eliminated all the issues with we've got this weird plot of land that we can't figure out who it belongs to or something like this. And Peter Singer says, no, that's not really going to work, because London itself is defined by an isness, by a being that it contains, by certain properties like the table that make it what it is. And if we abstract London away from its material being and we turn it into an abstract universal of the perfect city, or of the London with a capital T and a capital L, it's unclear by what right we can call this new abstract city London. And in fact, it's unclear if we can call it any city at all, because it represents the perfect city. It has no particular being about it that sets it apart from other perfect cities. And as such, Peter Singer's like, look, if we want to make London more rational, we would have to take the London we already have with its isness and act upon its contradictions, which has a lot to play into, for example, Marx's reading of Hegel as a historical class consciousness of contradictions that are resolving themselves towards an absolute ideal of communism. And Hegel wants to ground these processes in real, not absolute universal ideas. He says that ultimately we do want to get to some kind of universal. For example, truth. We want our idea of truth to be able to take account of everything. We want our true statements to be binding to everything with which they could be referent to. Just like our idea of white, we want to be perfect in terms of capturing the reference that we're referring to when we use that word. And we are always going to run into these contradictions, which are going to call that into question. And another way to talk about the issue of drawing the line of being, kind of like we talked about with the fetus earlier, is with the ship of Theseus paradox. And this is a classic paradox where we've got this ship, a sail ship. It's got its big sail and mast and all its wooden boards that make it up. And the ship of Theseus is getting old. So some of the boards are starting to rot. And we take one of those rotting boards off and replace it with a new one. Is this still the same ship? Well, we would say, yeah. Everything is going to decay and kind of spiral down. We've got to change it. And little changes to something doesn't necessarily mean that it's not it anymore. It's just different, kind of like we said earlier. So we go on and we start replacing more boards, one at a time. And it's like, okay, yeah, it's still the same ship. We're just replacing its parts. And then we replace the fabric that makes the big sail, and we replace the wheel to locomote it, and eventually all of the parts are replaced. Is it the same ship? It's unclear, because there are two senses, one in which it is and one in which it isn't. If it is the case that from each step to the next, one changing of the parts doesn't destroy the whole being of the ship, then we would have to say it still is the same ship. But, let's say the ship at the beginning of this process was super old and rickety, kind of like Blackbeard's ship in Pirates of the Caribbean. It's just disheveled. And then the ship at the end of the process is brand new, because we've replaced all the parts and we've done it one by one. it's unclear that we can call it the same ship. I mean, it has a different material being, and it's pretty clear to see that it is a different ship. So the question is, as we're changing this ship, and we can view this on a timeline from point A here to point B here. And at point A here, the ship is where it started, and at point B, this is where it ended. And there are all these successive points along this timeline where the ship is going through changes. And we say, okay, still the same ship, still the same ship, still the same ship, and we're going one by one by one. But if this is a different ship, at some point along the line, it had to become a different thing. And the question is, at what point? Because if we choose to draw the line between one moment of the ship and the next where only one board has been replaced, it's like that's kind of an arbitrary line. It's like, what is our definition of the old versus the new ship if just the change of a board can change them? And I mean, think about this for humans. We are composed of atoms, which are always in Brownian motion. They're always doing this shaking, this random shaking where they're just kind of going along and they're shaking. And, if you zoom out a lot, you get a human. And it looks like one solid object with no space in between it. But of course, it's all these particles constantly changing and becoming. That's an important kind of Hegelian idea. That inherent in the idea of being, of what it is to be a human, is becoming, is changing. It is defined by the fact that it never stays at one point, but it's always changing and it's always developing. And in terms of the ship of Theseus, we kind of say, okay, it is kind of a constant process of becoming, of it is being replaced and its form is changing. So we run into a problem in which it seems silly to say it's a different ship. It's just, it only looks like a different ship if we zoom all the way out and we see just the beginning and the end. And it's like, okay, yeah, it's a different ship. But if we really zoomed in, we would see that in fact it's the same thing. And think about this for people. Think about yourself at 2 years old versus 92 years old. If you zoomed all the way out and just looked at the infant and the elderly, you would see no connection. But of course, if you went sequentially, you would see that this is just a constant kind of leveling up process, so to speak. It's not literally always leveling up, because at some point you're kind of getting older till you die, or in some sense you're always dying. But regardless, inherent in the idea of being is becoming. That something is never staying the same, but it's always trending to come out of itself into a new form to become something else. And the question is, if we zoom all the way out like this, by what right does the 2-year-old and the 92-year-old have the ability to be called under the same name, be the same person? Everything about them is different materially. All their atoms are different from where they were when they were 2 years old. They have different memories. Now the 92-year-old will share some memories with the 2-year-old, but they have additional memories. The 92-year-old has memories that the 2-year-old does not. Their height and weight and physical health is different. Everything about them materially is different. But we would say they're the same person, right? I mean, I'm not going to say that at some arbitrary, age 65, you just suddenly become a different person. And the elderly you versus the middle-aged you versus the young you versus the infant you are completely different people. That doesn't really make any sense. And as such, the idea of identity of, for example, of Gavin, of me, is the idea that there is some universal definition which applies to you across your material differences. So identity is not reducible to materiality. That's an important thing for Hegel, is that if we try to ever talk about the material being of something at one point, like the ship of Theseus before it goes through its changes, and we talk about the material being at the end, they're going to be different things. But the problem is, this isn't how things work. They're not abstract binaries, but rather they're a constant cycle of changing towards another thing. So because of the idea of becoming, the idea of something being a universal meets us with a couple challenges. Because if we were just talking about what it means to be a particular table, and we say it has these certain properties, all of these properties are always changing. Materially speaking, atoms that make it up at any point in time are at completely different places at every single other point in time. Statistically speaking, it's near impossible that those atoms will all be in the same place ever again. It might even be impossible. I'm really not sure, physically speaking. So with the problem of becoming, we have an ontological problem with a universal, namely a name or an identity or an attribute, which is that in persisting across time, we have to have some sort of unifying definition which goes beyond the material. The idea of Gavin is not something that is bound to any particular form. Because if I'm Gavin here, I'm Gavin because all my atoms are in a particular place. Because I have, just like the table, I have certain attributes about me. I have my limbs and all the stuff we talked about, but also my hands are in a particular position. And I have certain memories. Now, am I still Gavin if I'm like this? My hands are in a different spot. I have new memories and thoughts that Gavin never even knew about or had never even experienced. And obviously this might seem a little bit pedantic, but the point is that a universal definition always has to take account of multiple particulars. And this is where Hegel comes in. Is Hegel wants our ideas of universals to be able to take account of all the particulars, of all the contradictions to every definition we come up with, yet not get rid of them. So we come to an issue. Let's say I have this glass of water and it's pretty full. I'm thirsty and I have to drink so that my voice stays good. Now it has less water, right? So if we wanted to talk about the being of the cup at point A, before I drank any water out of it, I can talk about the material properties of the cup, and I can also quantify the being of the cup as a particular by the amount of water that's in it, because that is part of its material conditions. At point B, though, one of the essential properties of the cup, namely the amount of water that's in it, is different. And here we are getting into an area of intro to Hegel studies when we're trying to talk about the dialectic that I have to be very careful with, and you have to follow me all the way through. And I'm going to say some stuff about Hegel that is problematic insofar as I disagree with it. But it's what Hegel says. At point B, the glass is in a very different position. And we could lay this out in a sort of equation where, just like we had done with the table where we talked about its properties, we have a thing at point A. We have the glass of water or the cup of water at point A where it had a higher amount of water in it than it does now. And one of its properties is the amount of water it has in it. And just like the ship of Theseus, it has changed to a new form. And we could say, by what right is this cup the same as the one before? We could say, in a sense, it's not. We could say that this is a completely new thing because the properties that made up the cup before are no longer within it. Its being has changed. It has come out of itself to form a new being. And of course, I've inserted some vocabulary about becoming a new thing, but just like the ship of Theseus, if we have a material reality at some point and another material reality at another point, we have to solve for some sort of connection, for some sort of enduring being that makes this what it is. Because this is a latent property of everything, that it has identity or being or existence or whatever we want to call it. It has something that makes it what it is. And whenever I use language, for example, I imply identity. I imply that the words that I say, for example, cup, refers to something. And latent in that sort of play of signs, per se, of signifying something, I imply some sort of isness that that word is the referent of. And the problem is things are not static entities. If we want to say that something is identifiable by its characteristics, and solely by those characteristics, either its material conditions or what it's useful for or does, if those change, according to that definition, it's not that thing anymore. So this glass or this cup of water, it's not a glass, it's a cup, is no longer the same cup by that definition. But that just doesn't track, right? We don't go living like that. And really, we cannot go on living like that because the idea of something enduring across time, and this is kind of where Heidegger comes in a sense, the idea of time is crucial to our idea of being. That something has successive states across time, that it endures across time, is in a sense how we can even talk about it. Because I can say that, for example, in a lot of early philosophy, the idea of being, one of it was substance, form, and extension. So it has some substance it's made out of, it has a form, which is the shape of that substance, and it has extension, how extended is that substance. And it's unclear without temporal extension, without something existing across time, how we could really talk about it. Because it's always just one complete universal, and in a sense it's an abstract universal. And the important Hegelian point here is that something is always defined in reference to what it is not. So for example, the idea of roundness is defined by not being angular or not being square. the idea of whiteness is defined by it not being green, or it not being black, or it not being yellow. And the idea of being, of something being a certain way, is defined by it not being another way. And even more critically, the idea of being itself depends upon the idea of nothing. So whenever we want to talk about the material reality of something, we always have to have it enduring across time, because I can say it is with reference to something else, which it shares that isness with, namely itself replicated across time. But the problem is, we have change in here, and change messes things up, because this cup, like we've talked about, if we want to define things by form and substance and extension, it doesn't share those qualities anymore. It's different. So difference gets in the way of a universal being universally applicable. But we could set this up in a sort of equation, namely the dialectic, where this makes sense. And that is to say, we have the cup at point A in time, where it had more water than it does now. That we will call our thesis. It is the original state in this equation, and it has a certain isness. Then we have its antithesis. It is changed. It has a different material quality. And the question is, if the thesis has come outside of itself to become an antithesis, by what right can we say that either one of these terms on its own is able to take account for what it is to be this cup? What is the isness within it that allows it to be what it is? And Heraclitus, way before Hegel, wants to say that inherent in all of being is becoming, that a river is defined by its flowing, that a river is not one particular state of the waters within it at any particular time, but rather is defined by its flowing and by its changing and becoming. But the problem is, if we want to say that the cup is becoming, we already have access to a definite identity that we're trying to talk about. So we could say it's always becoming, but it is right now. And if this is how it is right now, and it was at some other point, by what right can we say they're the same thing? Hegel says that we need to synthesize these two dialectical moments, as he calls it. The thesis and antithesis are moments of the dialectic. Hegel says we should synthesize these together into a more coherent and a wider sense of what this cup is, by taking account of the thesis of the water at one point in time, and taking account of the antithesis of the water at a different point in time. We have a much firmer understanding of the cup by taking into account both of these moments and saying the cup is something that has water A and B. But the problem is, if we want to synthesize the dialectic like we did, we cannot get rid of those first two moments of the thesis and antithesis when we synthesize them into a truer form. We have to maintain both the thesis and the antithesis and the synthesis at the same time. At the same time is the crucial part of the dialectic, and a lot of people have criticized this because there are clearly some issues with talking about the dialectic like this, because it violates the law of non-contradiction. So something is, namely this cup, is one state and is another at the same time, if we're talking about understanding the cup dialectically and the water that's inside it. And we can understand this if we use a different example. Let's say I'm trying to talk about water, and my thesis is water is a liquid. My antithesis could be above 100 degrees Celsius, water is a gas. So we are met with a contradiction which shows a real lack in the being of the thesis. Something that it altogether lacks to take into consideration, namely temperature or something like this. And we could synthesize these two ideas together and say, below 100 degrees Celsius, water is a liquid. And this seems to take into account both moments in order to arrive at a more fundamental truth. And this is not something that just Hegel said. This is kind of latent in the idea of where the term dialectic came from, namely dia, two, and lektikos, conversation. Think like kind of related to like lexicon or lectical. And Plato said that how we can come to the truth is by engaging in these dialogues between two people. And we run into these contradictions with our definitions, and hopefully eventually we'll reach some truth, even if that truth is that we know nothing. At least that's some kind of truth. And Hegel says that's great, but it fails to really understand being because it doesn't truly take account of difference, say the difference of the water in the cup at two different points. When we synthesize the dialectic, we understand the difference of the being at different points. But if we synthesize it into a universal, a more universal definition of the cup that takes account of each of the moments, and we just look at the synthesis, we've in effect created the abstraction that is devoid of the material characteristics that make the dialectic so much more special than just talking about the forms or talking about the perfect city. And this is a crucial part of Hegel's philosophy, which is that all three of the moments of the dialectic must be retained at the same time. That the synthesis and the antithesis map out the contradictions inherent in the oneness of the cup as a universal, as our synthesis that we've reached. And if we just take account of this synthesis, for example, going back to our definition of water, our synthesis of water is a liquid below 100 degrees Celsius. Without taking those moments into account that created our synthesis, we have created an empty term that needs the same kind of fleshing out that the synthesis did. The synthesis was unspecific because it failed to take into account the difference inherent in water, namely that at different temperatures, water is different things. And the synthesis tries to take into account this difference by being more specific. And Hegel says that the problem with people like Plato is they thought we can just get more and more and more specific. And Hegel says no. If we just take this final universal truth, like the idea of a perfect city, and we just look at that, we in effect become separated from the material reality of the moments of the dialectic that make it so fleshed out. This is kind of like if you started reading a book from the last 2 pages, and there's 302 pages in the whole book. And let's say the last 2 pages give a summary of what has happened. And it's some kind of, I don't know, maybe there's a narrator, and the narrator is like, we started all the way back in 1720, and we've gone through so many journeys where blah, blah, blah has killed blah, 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 blah. And you go through those last 2 pages. You could say that you know the truth of the story or the book, of what's being said. But Hegel thinks that this is kind of like taking the absolute or the universal alone without taking account of its moments. That, in fact, if you read the story from beginning to end, you would realize that all those other 300 pages that you didn't read are fleshing out those 2 pages, such that there is a real truth that you can be said to be missing out on in the last 2 pages. Even if you know what happens with every character. Let's say we have a character which does one action in the whole story. He makes a fist, like this, like to try to show off his muscles. That's the only action he does in the entire story. And in the last 2 pages, in the summary, it says that this character makes, he flexes his muscles. Nevertheless, if you were to go back into those 300 pages where he does that, maybe the story talks about his mindset behind doing that, of the message he was trying to convey, of some kind of historical background for why he thought it was a symbolic act or something like this. It can be said very confidently that to know the truth of that action is to not just know a single moment of it, of the final action that has been revealed in the summary, but is also to know the moments, the changing, dialectically advancing moments that go into making that truth. So Hegel's idea of truth is trying to synthesize difference and take account of difference by taking all the moments of truth at the same time. Now, we have some problems. And one of these is that it breaks the law of non-contradiction brazenly. And in the Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel announces his reticence with these laws of logic, as he calls them. And he says that they can be problematic. And you start to kind of get what he's saying, and it's like, okay, I think I might be able to get behind what you say. Because if we think about a human, for example, and we think of all the different moments that make him or her or they up, from a young age to elderly to dead to forgotten. And you say, okay, I guess if I really want to understand what it is to be this person, maybe it's me, Gavin, I have to understand the moment when Gavin is 2 years old and the moment where Gavin is 92. At the same time, if I want to get a fuller access to the truth of the situation. But a lot of philosophers have criticized this because, for example, when I talked about the material reality of the cup earlier, we had access to a very definite thing at a very definite amount of time. And it's hard to say phenomenologically that it is becoming. And what I mean by phenomenologically, because of course Hegel is one of the founders kind of phenomenology. You've got Kant and people before him, but Hegel is kind of fleshing it out and changing it and really setting the stage for people like Heidegger or Sartre. And to speak phenomenologically is to speak in terms of phenomena, in terms of experience, because to speak of pure abstracts, like Hegel says, is to be silly. If we actually want to talk about the being of something, we have to talk about the being that we actually experience, because we can't talk about things we haven't experienced, because how are you going to talk about that? Talking necessitates a referent that one refers to in experience. Even if it's some kind of imaginary idea, it's known through experience or something like this. And as such, the difficulty comes when we consider that when we talk about the being of something, even if we try to approach it dialectically, we already always have access to a very definite being that we're trying to talk about. And we could say, okay, we're trying to get fuller perspective for this being. But nevertheless, Hegel is trying to get behind the emerging of identity. How do universals form that we can understand through experience as referring to a particular? So certain properties like roundness or softness, Plato is going to say exist in some kind of form, but Hegel is going to say that no, in fact, we have access to that through dialectically understanding how those properties are folding out and coming out of themselves and coming up against their own contradictions. And Hegel is trying to get at how exactly being emerges as something that we are able to access. But it seems like if we want to start off this process of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, which is kind of the dialectic, because like we talked about already, the dialectic is three moments, but it's also one unity of moments all at the same time. So it's a three-step process, but it's also a one-step process, which Hegel tries to use this to talk about the Trinity and fails, in my opinion. It fails anyways to make it any more convincing. But if we want to talk about this thesis, antithesis, synthesis, we have to start out with a being with definite being already. And then it goes through its contradictions and gets sublated, and we'll talk about what that means in just a sec, and forms a synthesis, and then forms this dialectical triangle that gets understood together. And we already have to have being. We already have to have something to start off this project. And if Hegel wants to say, look, being is actually always becoming. It's always coming out of itself, and anytime we try to talk about being, it's always going to come out of itself to a contradiction and go through this process whereby it's going to get synthesized into the dialectic, and the moments will be sublated or taken account of, but also usurped, and give us some fuller idea of being. The question is, how did we get to that being in the first place that we started? It's almost like we have to presume the process of dialectic has already happened. But, I mean, if you just presume it already happened, then that's the same kind of abstract universal we've talked about before. We've treated something like it is a thing without actually having to go through its contradictions, which is like saying a thing exists at one infinitesimally small point in time and then never appears again. We can't really talk about it because it doesn't have any extension across time or anything like this. And because it has no reference, which is also itself, that can give it some kind of universality, that can give it some coherence across time and space that allows us to actually talk about it. So that's one of the problems is with the law of non-contradiction. And the other problem, which I'll only talk about briefly because I talked about it in my lecture on Homi Bhabha, as well as my one on John Cage's For the Birds, I think. I know I talked about it in Bhabha for sure. Which Deleuze and Guattari want to talk about too, is it seems that in synthesizing the dialectic, we're of course trying to reach some universal truth. But if that universal truth is also three particular moments at the same time, it's unclear if we are really able to take account of these differences and let them remain, if ultimately they're being synthesized into one thing. So, for example, the ship of Theseus. It's got all these points at different moments in time in which the boards are being replaced, and it's got old form and new form, and we're talking about whether it's the same ship or not. The problem is, if we try to understand this ship of Theseus dialectically, and we say, okay, at each of these moments, it's got a thesis where it has all these boards and an antithesis where one of the boards is changing, and to understand it dialectically, we synthesize these two together to get a more fuller understanding, but we also take account of those moments and keep them in our understanding of kind of the larger picture. If we do that, it seems that we tend towards a universal picture of truth with a capital T that is understanding difference only to usurp it. And this is a problem which, in a sense, reveals the problem of violating the law of non-contradiction in Hegel's process, is Hegel can only understand difference as sameness. And I heard that somewhere. I didn't come up with it, but it was on some video and I can't remember what it is. But Hegel can only understand difference as sameness insofar as difference always has to be taken account of dialectically. We always have to synthesize these contradictions into a fuller truth. And in talking about this fuller truth, you could say that we're taking account of difference, but you could also say that we are usurping difference and making it rather insignificant, maybe to our detriment, because each of these moments in the dialectic which is being synthesized has to be taken account of with full ontological status. They both have to be very sure things, and they both have to be things that are already there. We've got a material cup with a being that is already there. When we talk about the cup at point A, when it has lots of water, and then we have another one with a material being already there when we're talking about the cup with less water in it. And when we try to synthesize this, the problem is we are taking account of difference, but only insofar as they are instrumental for a larger picture, and in a way where we cannot violate the law of non-contradiction, and we cannot say that cup at point A and cup at point B are ontologically the same in terms of their material being and their very essence of what they are, because they have properties about them that are different. And we try to use some sort of universal to synthesize these together, but it is clear that in using a universal, and we try to talk about the cup, it's unclear if we are referring to any one moment at all. Because if our idea of the cup, as in the cup, the particular cup that we've used in this instance, and it is plagued by the problem of difference, of having different forms across time, and we try to turn it into some universal idea that tries to take account of that difference, it's not clear that we can simultaneously hold both states of the cup at the same time and in the same respect. And if we cannot do that. So Hegel wants to say, look, I mean, if you can't do that, then you're just taking the cup as this barren object that has no objectivity because it doesn't have any persistence across time. Just like we've talked about before, something has to have material existence and go through these changes, but also, in a sense, it has to have something that it is, which we can point to. But if isness is always changing and always becoming, it's unclear if we can ever have being in the first place. And Hegel tries to fix this by taking account of difference and synthesizing it and saying, look, if we want to understand being, we have to understand that no matter how microscopic we get, that's not how we're going to fix things. Instead, we have to think macroscopically and look at the whole situation. But the problem is, Hegel violates the law of non-contradiction, and he is only understanding difference as sameness. And if you want a more full understanding of Hegel, you should watch my video on the master-slave dialectic, and probably also to kind of see some of these ideas, my lecture on Foucault or on Homi Bhabha, because both of these figures give us very clear understandings of the practical implications of Hegel. And we can think about the practical implications of this problem of difference very quickly if we talk about, for example, national identity. Let's say we're talking about what does it mean to be an American? And I'm using this term to refer to the US, cognizant of the fact that America is not just the US. I mean, technically there is North and South America, so maybe in a broad sense, America is two whole continents. Or maybe you want to say America is just North America, still you've got Canada, Mexico, and the US, and you've got another amount of smaller countries in like Central America that are kind of bridging the gap. And we're trying to talk about what it is to be an American. So the idea of American is our universal. It represents a universal identity which can take account of different particulars and still be able to refer to them all. So if we want to do this, just like we did with tables, we might have to talk about some sort of identity that all Americans have that make them what they are. Let's say all Americans are American citizens. This might sound perfectly fine because this, in a sense, is a legalistic definition. But what about someone who, and let's just completely ignore whether or not this is possible and just treat it as a thought experiment. Someone immigrates to the US and fights in World War II. and they are not a citizen. And they fight valiantly, and they are the sole factor that won some battle. Without them, they wouldn't have been able to win this battle. And maybe it was, I don't know, driving back the Nazis or something like this. And the foreigner comes back. It seems that fighting for America makes you American in a very deep sense. That something about being an American is defined by your ideals that you strive for. So maybe these are ideas of virtue or freedom or property or of trade or of nobility or of sacrifice and bravery. And we could say that in a sense, this person who is not a US citizen is an American. Or let's take a more realistic example. People who aren't US citizens who come and immigrate to the United States and they pay taxes, or maybe they work in the economy, because the fact of the matter is that in the US, immigrants are what allow our economy to function. It's clear that, if America is defined by our material conditions, such as our economy and our school systems and the police and the government and whatever you have, and of course this is representative of the citizens, even those who are non-citizens, they are contributing to what makes America America. So, okay, we say maybe citizenship is not the best way of defining what it means to be an American, because there are certain ideas of virtue and utility that mean that maybe those who are contributing to America is what makes it America, and that doesn't necessarily mean being a citizen. Let's go kind of the nationalist route and say something that I don't agree with, and say everyone who's America is white. This is kind of something that Hitler did in Germany with the idea of the Aryan race, that the true Germany is only for Aryans. And this goes with a whole history of assuming race has some sort of universality and assuming that Aryan actually means something and that it has some noble past. Obviously, this is silly. If we look at the US, there are plenty of Black Americans, there are plenty of Latinx Americans, there are plenty of Asian Americans, there are plenty of Middle Eastern Americans, plenty of British Americans, whatever you have. And this idea of whiteness is not going to take account of the nation and of what it means to be an American. And maybe, and I'm hoping you're playing devil's advocate when you say this, but maybe you say that, no, this is actually what being an American means. I know there are people who claim to be Americans that aren't white, but in fact, the only ones that are American is white. And Hegel would say that's wrong, because that is an abstract idea of the US that is completely devoid of the material reality, of the phenomenological reality of what is the kind of US we experience. It's like talking about the perfect London as something that has none of the characteristics that even make it London anymore. You could try to think of some high-in-the-sky ideal of what the US ought to be, but Hegel's kind of critical of this throughout the phenomenology, especially kind of into his last sections on ethics and religion, that these ought statements don't really take account of how ontology is. That America is such a way whether we like it or not. So maybe we could talk about, we said citizenship, we said skin color, we could say maybe it's some shared history. That's not going to work either because we've got immigrants, we've got people who are Native Americans who have lived here for generations longer than people who call themselves Americans, who in fact are the descendants of people who immigrated from Britain and from Ireland and from other parts. So it's quite clear to see here that any idea of American is bound to fail. And in fact, this idea of American is always in flux. Now, we might say, okay, what if we try to resolve being American dialectically? And we try to take account of these contradictions, and we try to use all this, and we go through the process that I just did. We make a thesis, we talk about how it's wrong, and we move to the next one, and we keep doing this. And Hegel's like, look, if we do this, and we learn to take these moments simultaneously in our pool of truth, we're going to eventually reach truth as all these contradictions resolve themselves dialectically. This has the potential of hinging on a very dangerous kind of nationalism. We talk about what it means to be an American, and we try to ground it in something which takes account of these contradictions. But it seems like we should have learned our lesson by now, that to come up with any kind of universal is nevertheless going to fail to take account of certain particulars, because particulars are always changing. And universals, or the absolute, tries to pretend like it is this solid entity of truth that always stays the same. But the fact is, that's just not how things work. And Hegel says, okay, what if I say that it is universally true that things are always changing? So, kind of like saying it's universal that things are always particular. Okay, maybe we get somewhere. But we could question whether or not this might be reactionary and maybe even repressive, because maybe we're trying to take account of our ethnic makeup of the United States, or of the religious makeup of the United States, or of the historical makeup of different traditions in the United States. It's unclear that we could create some cogent, codified image that takes account of everything without paving over certain things. And this is why a lot of people criticize Hegel for being the progenitor of modern totalitarianism, and that this really created the totalitarian ideal, because it's this universal truth which seems to take account of everything. I mean, the way Hegel lays this out in the phenomenology, it is so captivating. Because by the time that Hegel gets to the end of the phenomenology, he's like, look, you can answer every single problem you have with this doctrine, per se, of everything being a dialectically unfolding rational event that culminates through its contradictions being sublated. He's like, this solves everything, because we can have universals and particulars at the same time. But, I mean, think of the Third Reich as a universal. It tries to take account of all of the German identity, but by purging Jews and homosexuals and people who aren't measuring up to certain ideas of strength, for example. And there were disabled people who were purged. So all these artificial ideas of isness of the nation are constructed out of the blue away from the material conditions of things. And as such, I think Hegel tries to figure out the universal and particulars and try to create it into some kind of system. But I don't think he recognizes the potentially problematic parts of this thought. And I'll leave it to you to kind of go from here with an understanding of this and read the Phenomenology of Spirit, for instance, or read some critiques of it, maybe, or some commentaries, maybe read some Deleuze and Guattari, maybe some Foucault, some Baba, or something like this, and see where it goes, and see what you think about Hegel. And that's it for this lecture, and I hope to see you in another one.